Hey, you guys. I hope that you have had a wonderful week. I hope that you enjoyed part one of these two episodes. I know this is a very sensitive topic, and my main goal is to just understand some of the psychological aspects of these characters while being respectful. But today, not only are we going to focus on their psychopathy, but we are also going to focus on the victims as well, because they are the most important part of this, regardless. So with that, I am your host, Kitty Gonzalez, and you are listening to What the Psychology. Alright, so let's dive in here. Last week, we kind of talked more about what happened and more of what the two perpetrators, some background on them and what they had planned. And we also discussed some misconceptions about what happened and what we thought was the motivation behind this shooting. But today we're going to dive deeper and we're going to dive into the psychopathy of the two, some other things that are similar to that, and also the victims. So at first we didn't really know why these two did it. Like I said, we kind of came to two conclusions. Either they were bullied or that it was just too horrific to kind of wrap our minds about it. But what is interesting is the FBI and its team of psychiatrists and psychologists, they have reached an entirely different conclusion than what we thought. They believe they know why EH and DK killed, and their explanation is both more reassuring and also troubling than what we originally thought. So 3 months after the massacre, the FBI convened a summit in Leesburg, Virginia, and that included world-renowned mental health experts, including Michigan State University psychiatrist Dr. Frank Ochberg. He's mentioned a lot in here, as well as supervisory special agent Dwayne Fusilier, who is also mentioned a lot. And he is the FBI's lead Columbine investigator and a clinical psychologist. So he has a lot of, both of these two have a lot of experience, a lot of research under their belt, things like that. So both of these, they have shared their conclusions publicly. And so let's kind of dive into this. So the first steps to kind of understanding Columbine are to forget the popular narrative about jocks, goths, and the trenchcoat mafia. We kind of dove into that a little bit. And also to abandon the core idea that Columbine was a simply school shooting. I know that sounds really weird, but just follow me here. We can't understand why they did it until we understand what they were doing. So school shooters, they tend to act impulsively and they attack the targets of their rage, students and faculty. Alright, but EH and DK, they planned for a year and they dreamed much bigger than a typical school shooter. The school kind of served more as a means to a grander end, if that makes sense. They really wanted to terrorize the entire nation by attacking a symbol of American life. Their slaughter was aimed at students and teachers, but it wasn't necessarily motivated by resentment of them. Students and teachers were just more of a convenient query or a representative. And this is what the Oklahoma bombing perpetrator described as collateral damage. And you have to remember, they idolized him, and I'm not going to say his name. His initials are T, and his initials are TM. But I really don't want to give him the credit for anything or give him any notoriety. So you have to remember, they idolized him. The killers in the school shooting of Columbine, they actually laughed at petty school shooters, which is funny because that's kind of what they became. I kind of find it ironic and kind of I don't even know how to describe that, because they thought that petty school shooters weren't really good enough or whatever, and that's kind of what they ended up being because they were so bad at doing what they originally planned. They bragged about dwarfing the carnage of the Oklahoma City bombing, and originally scheduled their bloody performance for its anniversary. They wanted to go big, you guys. They were not just planning a school shooting. They were wanting a bombing that killed hundreds. So DK, he boasted on video about inflicting the most deaths in the U.S. history. Columbine was intended not primarily as a shooting at all, but as a bombing on a massive scale. If they hadn't been so bad at wiring the timers and making the propane bombs they set in the cafeteria, they probably would have wiped out like 600 people. After those, which remember, they had bombs in their cars, they would have ripped through more crowds, and that would have probably targeted more survivors, rescue workers, police, reporters. So the climax would be captured on live television. This is what they were planning. And it wasn't just a fame or notoriety that they were after. Agent Fusilier actually has said that they were gunning for devastating infamy on the historical scale, but he clarifies by saying that their vision was to create a nightmare so devastating and apocalyptic that the entire world would shudder at their quote-unquote power. EH and DK would have dismayed that Columbine was dubbed as the worst school shooting in American history. Like, they would have been disappointed at that, which I think is ironic. And it kind of mocks them because they were setting their sights on the world's greatest mass murders. But the media, they never saw past the choice of venue. The school setting drove analysis in precisely the wrong direction. Fusilier and Ochberg say that if you want to understand the killers, quit asking what drove them. EH and DK were radically different individuals. We kind of talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but we're really going to dive into that now. They had vastly different motives and opposite mental conditions. So to dive into them kind of individually, we're also going to read some of their journal entries so you can get an understanding of them on a deeper level, which is kind of sickening, but for the sake of purpose of understanding their mental conditions, we're going to have to kind of do that. So DK, remember, he's kind of more of the depressed one, as you'll see here. He writes in florid, morose prose and poetry. He talks about God, self-medicating with alcohol, self-mutilation, and his persistent thoughts of suicide. So far more often than violence, he talks about love, both abstractly and personally. And the journal contains 2 notes to a girl he was fixated on, but neither of those were delivered. And he had many drawings of hearts. Overall, DK, he felt that he had ruined his life and that no one understood him. He saw other people as zombies, but they were also the lucky ones. So he wrote that in the journal's first page, and it kind of gives more of an explanation with what he wrote. What he wrote was fact. People are so unaware. Well, ignorance is bliss, I guess. That would explain my depression. I really hate to say this, but I can kind of relate to this on the basis of having depression myself and people that are different. And so I hate to kind of talk from his perspective, but I'm going to talk from my perspective as someone with depression and kind of divulging this idea for a bit. He said other people were zombies, but they were also lucky ones. So they were kind of ignorant, I guess. That's not really the part that I'm kind of understanding, but the part I'm understanding is that they were the lucky ones, because depression can be a very debilitative mental condition. And as you guys know, listening to previous episodes where I've talked about it and we've dove into depression as well, it can really affect your life, your motivation, if you can work, school, and it can lead to suicide as well. It's so hard. And so him saying that they are the lucky ones, I can really resonate with that, because I feel like people that don't have depression are lucky because they don't have to struggle with the mental condition that I have. So on that front, I can kind of understand where he's coming from, but I'm going to leave it at that because everything else that he's saying I can't really fully understand. He did say people are unaware. I feel like that's probably back in that time was more reality. I feel like nowadays people are more aware. of depression, but maybe back then he was talking about himself. Maybe people are so unaware that he's depressed. That I can kind of relate to. Because for me, I'm a very happy-go-lucky person. Like, when I'm not going through depression, and sometimes when I am, I'm just putting on a brave face. So I can understand that. Other than that, can't really understand or excuse, like, where he was coming from or his actions. So just want to kind of separate that a little bit. So DK, he is easier to comprehend. He is a more familiar type. He was a hothead, but depressive and suicidal, and he blamed himself for his problems. One of his last entries in his journal, it read, "I'm sick in humanity, maybe going NBK." Remember, NBK was natural born killers, which was their plan of the shooting, bombing, whatever. EH is the way to break free. I hate this. So this page was written, I'm not sure when, it was one of his last, but then there was another one written 5 days before the attack, and it ends with "time to die, time to be free, time to love." And nearly all the other remaining pages are filled with drawings of his intended outfit and weapons. So at some point he kind of just grasped to the idea of that was kind of like his only way out, I guess, from like my understanding. So now the other perpetrator, EH, he's more the psychopath, okay? He is more of the challenge to kind of grasp, I guess, at least from the outside looking in. We are going to divulge why he's kind of more simplistic than what we think, but from someone on the outside looking in, he can be more challenging to kind of figure out. Because he was sweet-faced and well-spoken. Adults and even other kids described him as nice. But you have to remember, he was cold, calculating, and homicidal. While DK was hurting inside, EH wanted to hurt people. That's famously what First Elias says. So EH was not merely a troubled kid. The psychiatrists say that he was a psychopath. And there is a big difference. Recently we talked about antisocial personality disorder, which is pretty much the same thing as psychopath. And you're going to see all of the symptoms of that as we go through this in EH. Remember, they lack empathy and remorse. They can put on a face and try to quote-unquote relate to people, but not fully. They put on a face to where it looks like they can relate to people and relate to empathy. They are sometimes grandiose, not always. Grandiose is more of a narcissistic trait. They more than likely, not always, or don't care about consequences. They don't really see consequences. They see themselves as superior in a sense, and that other people are inferior. That's also kind of a narcissistic trait. Those are just like a few basic ones. Of course, you can go back to that episode and see. So, while DK's journal was like more full of love and suicide and things like that, EH's journal is more single-minded. To him, people were robots conned into following a false social order. The same one that dared to judge him. Something he wrote a year before the attack is, "I have something only me and DK have, self-awareness." So often, his cruelty was unfocused and not really tied to any particular slight. It was compulsive. In addition to hating human beings, he also loved Nazis, their ideologies, and he wanted to kill mankind. In an entry from November of 1998, he described his fantasies, stating, "I want to grab some weak little freshmen and just tear them apart like an effing wolf, show them who is God." Yeah, so he kind of saw himself as a god, that he was superior. Everyone else around him was inferior to him and his ideas. EH did not see himself as a good kid pushed to violence. He wanted to be a domestic terrorist. In an apparent answer to his parents' concerns about his future, he wrote, "This is what I want to do with my life." So he wanted to hurt others. Let's make that very clear. About a year before the Columbine shooting, EH came the closest to explaining why he would shoot up a school. And kind of like we mentioned, before about his idea, his quote unquote idea of society, he really explains it here. So he wasn't really attacking specific people or even Columbine itself. He was attacking what school represented to him. The point of indoctrination into a society he despised, suppressing individuality and human nature. And what he wrote is, school is society's way of turning all the young people into good little robots and factory workers. He wrote this on April 21, 1998. Continuing, I will sooner die than betray my own thoughts, but before I leave this worthless place, I will kill whoever I deem unfit for anything at all, especially life. These are his thoughts. These are what he wrote. He is explaining himself here. It's not just psychologists just like, oh, I'm assuming he's this. They came to this conclusion based on both of these in both of their journals. So in the conference, it was years after the shooting, Dwayne Fusilier, he's the one from the FBI, he presented his belief that based on his homicidal fantasies, skills at lying, and lack of remorse, those are all what? Symptoms of what? He said that E.H. was a budding young psychopath. Now, however, in response to this, one of the participants raised an objection to this, saying, I think he was a full-blown psychopath, which a lot of people agreed. But maybe budding was just a word saying that because he was so young. But, yeah, pretty much was a psychopath. Other people didn't think for themselves and would never survive a doom test. This is what E.H. thought. A final solution like that of the Nazis was what he thought would save the world. Natural selection. This was the same message printed on his shirt during the shooting. So in popular usage, we hear all the time that any crazy killer is a psychopath. But even as we have divulged into this and on this podcast, that not everyone is a psychopath that is a murderer. In psychiatry, it is a very specific mental condition that rarely involves killing or even psychosis. Remember what we talked about with psychosis, which is associated with like schizophrenia, or when we talked about psychotic break early on. Remember, psychosis is being in and out of reality, like having delusions and having hallucinations or intense distress. People often get that confused with psychopathy. We have to remember that psychopaths are not disoriented or out of touch with reality. They do not experience delusions, hallucinations, or intense distress that characterize most other disorders. Dr. Robert Hare, in Without Conscience, he actually wrote this. It's a seminal book on the condition. And he was one of the psychologists that was consulted by the FBI about Columbine and the state. So he was involved in this. So unlike psychotic individuals, psychopaths are rational and aware of what they are doing and why they are doing it. Their behavior is a result of choice, freely exercised. Okay, big difference. Remember when we talked about, it was in the earlier episodes about psychotic break, and we talked about the story that was on Criminal Minds, and it was a guy who his girlfriend or fiance just proposed to her, and then the gang members killed her right in front of him, and he had trauma to where he had dreams about retaliation of killing each and every gang member, but in reality, he was actually killing them. That was not really by choice or free exercise. He was having a psychotic break where, I know it kind of sounds awful to put it that way, that, oh, it wasn't his fault, but this, in like a court of law, is how they deem whether they can plead insanity or not. Pleading insanity isn't just saying, oh, I have a mental condition. For one thing, they have to be diagnosed with that, and there has to be a lot of evidence. But if they were under psychosis, then they can plead insanity. More like where being a psychopath, it is a choice. And I did kind of talk about how psychopaths, how we can deter them from harming others. And we kind of go into that later on in this episode. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that. Their thought process is just different, but everything that they do is a result of choice. They are choosing and freely exercising their behavior, whereas those with psychosis are not necessarily doing it as choice. I hope that breaks it down more, and I hope that makes sense. So diagnosing EH as a psychopath represents neither a legal defense nor a moral excuse, but it does illuminate a greater deal about the thought process that drove him to mass murder. This is what is very, very important, okay? Diagnosing him as a psychopath was not really a simple matter, but EH opened his private journal with the sentence, "I hate the effing world." And when the media actually studied Harris, they just focused on his hatred. They thought that maybe his hatred led to revenge, and it's really easy to get lost in the hate, which is what screamed out relentlessly from EH's website. And he said that he hated a lot of things. Here are some things he said. You know what I hate? Country music. You know what I hate? People who say that wrestling is real. Ouch, that kind of hurts because wrestling and jiu-jitsu are very close. You know what I hate? People who use the same word over and over again. Read an effing book or two. Increase your vocabulary. Effing idiots. You know what I hate? Stupid people. Why must so many people be stupid? You know what I hate? When people mispronounce words. Ouch. I do that a lot. And they don't even know it. Like across or espresso. Pacific, meaning specific. I'm guilty of that one. Two-pack instead of Tupac. Learn to speak correctly, you morons. You know what I hate? Star Wars fans. Ouch. That one really hurts, because I'm a big Star Wars fan. Get a friggin' life, you boring geeks. Those are all things he talked about on his website. And it rages on for page after page, and it's repeated in his journal and in the videos him and DK made. But Fuseli recognized a far more revealing emotional burst through both fueling and overshadowing the hate. What he was really expressing was contempt. So often we say we hate things, okay? We say, like he said, oh, I hate Star Wars fans, like, or I hate Star Wars or whatever. A lot of us use that word, but this goes deeper when it comes to EH. And this is kind of what Fuselier recognized. Instead of just hating, he is more disgusted with people around him. Or as he puts it, the morons around him. They're not the rantings of an angry young man picked on by jocks until he's not going to take it anymore. These are the rantings of someone with a messianic grade superior complex, out to punish the entire human race for its appalling inferiority. So it may look like hate, but it's more about demeaning other people. A second confirmation of the diagnosis was EH's perpetual deceitfulness. That's another symptom. I lie a lot, which is something that EH wrote in his journal almost consistently, and to everyone, and to keep my own butt out of the water. Let's see, what are some of the lies I told? Yeah, I stopped smoking. For doing it, not for getting caught. No, I haven't been making bombs. No, I wouldn't do that, and countless other ones. That's what he would say. EH claimed to lie to protect himself, but that appears to be something out of a lie as well. He lied for pleasure, something that Fuselier says. So there's a term in psychology called duping delight, and psychologist Paul Ekman is the one who kind of came up with this, and it represents a key characteristic of the psychopathic profile. So duping delight is like lying for pleasure. It's not just lying so you won't get caught. It's just because you enjoy to lie and you enjoy to manipulate others, right? Manipulation. So EH, he was married to his deceitfulness with a total lack of remorse or empathy, which we know is another distinctive quality. Fuselier was finally convinced of his diagnosis when he read EH's response to being punished after being caught breaking into a van. Remember when that happened and they were sent to do like a juvenile diversion program and they successfully completed it? Well, DK and EH, they avoided prosecution for the robbery by participating in that program, and it pretty much involved counseling and community service. Both killers feigned regret to obtain an early release, but EH had relished the opportunity to perform. Very important. So he wrote an ingratiating letter to his victim offering empathy rather than just apologies. Fuseli remembers that it was packed with statements like, "Geez, I understand how you feel and I understand what this did to you." But he wrote that for effect. This is what Fuseli said. That was complete manipulation. And almost the exact time he wrote down his real feelings in his journal. Isn't America supposed to be the land of the free? How come if I'm free, I can't deprive stupid, effing, dumb people from his possessions if he leaves them sitting in the front seat of his van out in plain sight and in the middle of nowhere in a Friday night? Natural selection, which is in all caps. Effers should be shot. Very far from the letters that he presented the victim of his crime. So EH's pattern of grandiosity, glibness, contempt, lack of empathy, and superiority read like the bullet points on Harris' psychopathy checklist and convinced Fuselier and the other leading psychiatrists that were close to the case that, EH was a psychopath. It begins to kind of explain EH's unbelievably callous behavior, his ability to shoot his classmates, then stop to taunt them while they withered in pain, then finish them off, which is exactly what he did. And we have to remember that psychopaths, they are guided by such a different thought process than any non-psychopathic human. And we tend to find their behavior inexplicable, which is, to us, that makes sense. But they are actually way easier to predict than the rest of us once you understand them. Don't believe me? Keep listening. So psychopaths, they follow much stricter behavior patterns than the rest of us. And this is because they are unfettered by conscience and they live solely for their own aggrandizement. Something to note here, Fuselier, he trains hostage negotiations. And the difference is so striking that he does train negotiators to identify psychopaths during a standoff. Because then they can immediately reverse their tactics if they think that they are facing one. It's kind of like flipping a switch between two alternate brain mechanisms. So, say in a hostage situation, you are confronting a normal person, you would try to empathize with them. You would try to see what their wants are and what they need, because usually there's some type of trade-off to why they are doing it. Usually they're doing it to get something in return. But when it comes to psychopaths, they're just doing it for the pleasure of it. So if you flip that switch, you have to kind of play on their ego a bit and be like, we understand why you're doing this and that you are far superior than your hostages. And you just have to remember that you are too great to commit this act, because why would someone so great have to sit in prison? Like, literally, that's kind of like the switch. And I hope that makes sense. It's such a different way of thinking because most of us are normal and we don't think that way. So flipping that switch can be kind of like very sickening, but it can be beneficial in the way of if you're negotiating with someone who's taken hostages and they are a psychopath. Because like the difference is, normal person, they're doing it in exchange for something. Psychopaths are just doing it for pleasure and because they think they're inferior. So you have to play on that. So, none of the victims, they don't mean anything to the psychopath. Literally, they're just doing it for pleasure. They recognize other people as only a means to obtain what they want, what they desire. So, not only do they feel no guilt for destroying lives, they don't grasp what they feel. So, the truly hardcore psychopath doesn't quite comprehend emotions like love or hate or fear because they've never experienced them directly. And when it comes to empathy, Dr. Scott in her book actually wrote that at what age empathy develops and different things like that. So I would definitely go and read her book because she really breaks this down. And I really enjoyed reading that part because it really gives you an understanding of how do they not develop empathy. So because of psychopaths and their inability to appreciate the feelings of others, some are just capable of behavior that normal people find not only horrific, but baffling. This is something that Hare wrote in his book. So, for example, they can torture and mutilate their victims with about the same sense of concern that we feel when we carve a turkey for Thanksgiving dinner. Boy, does that put it in perspective. I don't even know what else to say after that. So the diagnosis, this really transformed their understanding of the partnership. Despite the earlier reports about the two being equal partners, the psychiatrists, they now believe firmly that EH was the mastermind and driving force. The partnership did enable EH to stray from typical psychopathic behavior in one way. He did restrain himself. So usually psychopathic killers, they crave the stimulation of violence. So that's why often serial killers that they're murdering is regularly to feed their addiction. But he managed to stay mostly out of trouble for the year that he and DK were planning the attack. Ochberg theorizes that the two killers complemented each other. Alright, so remember, he's cool and calculating, and he calmed down DK when he got hot-tempered. Because remember, even though DK was suicidal, depressive, he was kind of a hothead. At the same time, DK and his fits of rage served as the stimulation that needed. So even though kind of calmed DK when he was hot-tempered, those fits of rage stimulated and related to Okay, so I hope you understand the psychopathy a little bit more. And now we are going to do a dive into the victims. And we are going to learn a little bit about them. Unfortunately, we're going to kind of talk about how they died. But I think that gives context to the torturous nature of and DK in this. Then we're going to talk about their background a little bit. So it's not going to be, oh, here's a victim, this is how they died. It's going to be, this is how they died, and these are some of their accomplishments, what they were like. We're going to get to know the victims a little bit more. The first victim we're going to talk about is Rachel Scott. She was born August 5th, 1981, and she was 17 years old. She was actually the first person who was killed in the shooting. She was hit 4 times while eating lunch with her friend, Richard Castaldo, on the grass outside the entrance of the school. Rachel was a devout Christian who was the subject and co-writer of several books. She was bullied throughout her high school years for her faith. Castaldo, who was shot 8 times and left permanently paralyzed from his injuries, said returned when he realized she was still alive and asked, "Do you still believe in God?" as he lifted her head by the hair. She answered, "You know I do," before told her, "Then go be with him," and shot her in the head. Her diaries have inspired many victims of bullying, and charity Rachel's Challenge is estimated to have reached out to 2 million students. Rachel was a vibrant and straightforward individual. She wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in, no matter what. She played the lead in a student-written play, The Smoke in the Room, co-starring her friends Nick Baumgart, Lauren Beecham, and others, and was writing a play for her senior year. She also liked photography and was active in the Celebration Christian Fellowship Church. She was made for the camera according to her father, Daryl, and was an aspiring writer and actress. "There's nothing I can add or take away from what she gave us," her mom Beth said. In those short 17 years, it was complete. So she actually quit smoking at the request of her friend Nick Baumgart, who later took her to the prom. Now, something that's kind of ominous is if she hadn't quit, it's quite possible she would have been at the smoker's pit during lunch instead of in the line of fire. As it was, she was eating lunch on the grass with her friend, Richard, when the shooters opened fire on the west entrance, near where she was seated on the grass. According to witnesses, she was hit and fell to the ground, where moments later one of the shooters, which we know now as EH, came down the hill and shot her at point-blank range when she tried to get up. She died from gunshot wounds to the head, chest, arm, and leg. One of the shooters, DK, he had known Rachel since kindergarten and had even been the sound tech for a talent show that she performed in 1998. Ironically, when the sound broke down, it was DK who saved the performance by hooking up a reserve tape deck. Rachel had been performing a mime dance, Watch the Lamb, which portrayed Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross along part of the Via Dolorosa. That same mime dance was later performed behind her coffin during her funeral. Rachel's family didn't know for certain that she was dead until Thursday, when her name was on the list of confirmed dead, but they all knew in their hearts that the worst was coming, as their prayers for her to turn up safe and sound went unanswered during those long hours between the shootings and the news of her death. Rachel had always been close with her brother Craig, who was actually in the library during the shootings, and he miraculously survived uninjured despite being next to Isaiah Scholes and Matt Ketcher, who are also victims in this case. But that last week before her death, Rachel and her dad had a long and bonding discussion, something that left both of them incredibly happy. For Daryl, that moment will later give him comfort when dealing with her death. So throughout her life, Rachel was an incredibly spiritual person who often wrote to God in her diaries about wanting to reach the unreached. She begged for him for the chance to show others the way, to let her life have some purpose in spreading his word. In 1998, she drew a collage of images that included a rose growing up out of Columbine with several dark drops spiraling it. And you can actually see this picture on the video Untold Stories of Columbine. On the morning of the shootings, she doodled a reprise of the picture, a pair of eyes carrying 13 teardrops onto that same rose, which ironically is the same number of victims the shooters would kill during the massacre just hours later. That is very ominous as well. After her death, Rachel's car was turned into a makeshift memorial by her friends, where it sat in the parking lot. In my eyes, she was just one of those kinds of people you know you won't ever meet again, Rachel's friend Lauren Beecham said of her. She was the kind of person only born once. Rachel was buried at Chapel Hill Memorial Gardens in the Columbine Memorial Garden in Littleton, Colorado. The next victim is Cassie Bernal, and she was born November 6, 1981, and she was 17 years old. She's the one who the story about being asked if she believed in God before being killed is often mixed up with, and we'll dive into that a little bit here. Cassie actually rebelled as a young teen, and she began experimenting with alcohol and drugs. Her parents sent her to a church retreat after she started having suicidal and homicidal thoughts against them. They said that they got their daughter back when she returned as an entirely different person, and she started over at a new school in Columbine. Cassie was studying in the library when the shooting started and tried to hide alongside another girl under a computer table. EH entered and slapped the bottom of the table twice before saying peekaboo. He bent down and shot Cassie in the side of the head, and she died immediately. So that's actually what really happened. So she was a born-again Christian, and that happened around 1997. So she was active in church youth programs and Bible study groups. Her parents called her Bunny Rabbit and said she loved to go rock climbing in Breckenridge. She had recently visited Great Britain, and her favorite movie was Braveheart. And as being mostly Scottish myself, I love Braveheart. For a long time after the shootings, it was believed that she was the girl in the library who was asked by one of the shooters, "Do you believe in God?" and was subsequently shot because she said yes. There's still a lot of controversy surrounding this. So according to the Columbine report, several witnesses claim that the conversation occurred between gunman EH and surviving victim Valine Schnur. But there's also been speculation that it could have been Rachel as well. So Valine herself has verified this fact. However, Joshua Lapp, a witness to library shootings, said in his interview with investigators that the shooters asked several people if they believed in God, and the answers given didn't seem to dictate who was shot or not. So it seems like this is something like that EH did to kind of taunt them, which would make a lot of sense. Especially since it's like multiple people saying that they did say yes or didn't, or were asked that question. Still, according to witness statements and the Columbine report, here is what happened to Cassie. When the shooters entered the library, she, like many other students, was hiding under the table she'd been sitting at when substitute teacher Patty Nielsen entered the library and told everyone to get down. She had her hands over her face, perhaps to keep from seeing what was happening, as she could hear other people being shot and killed in the library, near to where she was hiding. Just after shooting Steve Kernau and injuring Casey Rugseger, EH came around the table where Cassie and another girl were hiding. He slapped the top of the table twice with his left hand and said to the two frightened girls, "Peekaboo." He then bent down, pointed his sawed-off shotgun under the table, and fired once, shooting Cassie in the right side of her head, and she died immediately. When it was still believed that Cassie was the girl who said yes, she kind of became a martyr to the cause of Christianity. And her mother said that she couldn't think of a more honorable way to die than the way Cassie was taken. And her mom did write a book called She Said Yes. I have read it, like, back in high school, and it is a really good book. It does do a deep dive into Cassie and her life. However, I have seen reports where even after them confirming that Cassie was not the one who said yes, they're still kind of like continuing that idea that she was. The idea is still something that they want to kind of preserve, and the idea is true for some of the victims, but not all. But that was probably what they were told at first anyway. Her mom also said that, "I keep thinking about the things I need to do for Cassie." That's what she told the Oprah show in 1999. And then I catch myself, I don't need to do that. The Lord's taking care of those mom things I used to do. Cassie, she was buried in a white coffin that attendees at her funeral, her pastor called it a marriage to Christ, could sign. Her mom wrote, "Bunny Rabbit, my friend, my buddy, my daughter, my mentor. I will love you and miss you forever. I promise to take good care of your kitty. I know that Jesus is elated to have you in his presence. Your courage and commitment to Christ have gained you a special place in heaven, and I am proud to call you my daughter. I love you so much, Mom." So despite the fact that she likely didn't say anything to either of the gunmen, the story of the girl who said yes, it does still inspire people all over the world, and her family prefers to think of Cassie as that girl. And more than likely, if Cassie was asked, she would have said yes. So that's kind of like their thinking behind it. The next victim is Daniel Rohrbough, and I'm really sorry if I mispronounce any of these names. He was born March 2nd, 1984, and he was 15 years old. Dan's mom, who said she usually didn't see him in the morning, had a chit-chat with her son and gave him a kiss and a hug over breakfast that Tuesday before he walked out of their home and never returned. He was heading to a nearby park to eat his lunch with a Dr. Pepper in his hand when the gunman approached the school. Dan was shot in the chest, abdomen, and leg, and he died on the sidewalk. His death was probably the most public, and his body remained in a pool of blood outside the school. So Daniel, he enjoyed electronics and computer games. He was looking forward to getting his driver's permit soon. He was remembered as a fun guy. He helped in his father's stereo business every day after school, and during the summer, he worked on his grandfather's farm, harvesting wheat, as he had done since he was around the age of 3. He used that money he earned to buy Christmas presents for his family, and on Tuesday, Danny's father, Brian, knew something was wrong when his son failed to show up at the shop after school like normal. So Dan was heading out of the cafeteria that morning with his friends Lance Kirkland and Sean Graves when the shooters opened fire down the grassy knoll outside the school's west entrance. There was no warning for Danny and no chance. He was felled by shots to the abdomen and left leg. Lance tried to catch him but was shot as well. Moments later, DK shot him again at point-blank range in the chest. He bled to death on the sidewalk outside the school, where he laid for nearly 2 days before paramedics were allowed to move him. I just know I would be so mad if that was my child. Like, you weren't able to get to them for nearly 2 days, over 24 hours. His family, they were kept in the dark about what had happened to him. Law enforcement told them that they didn't know for certain that the body on the sidewalk was his, and they wouldn't let the family in to check for themselves. And it wasn't till the morning after the shootings that the family found out for certain what they already knew in their hearts, that it was indeed Danny's body outside, and they learned this news because it was splashed all over the morning news, and not because the family was told directly by officials. I know I would be so mad. So there was even more controversy over Daniel's death when Arapahoe County Deputy James Taylor, who had been a friend of the family, told Danny's parents that the boy may have been killed by friendly fire from a Denver SWAT team member. Lawsuits and independent investigation have confirmed that Dan did die from the shot fired by E.H., but it was never made clear whether or not Danny was hit in the crossfire by a bullet from law enforcement. The family later sued Taylor, who was suspended by the force. Additionally, there was initial confusion over which gunman was the one who had killed him. The Columbine report states that it was DK who fired the fatal shot, but an independent investigation by the El Paso County Sheriff's Department determined it was EH's weapon that was responsible. So saying that DK came up to him and shot him point blank, I don't really believe that. I kind of believe that was more of EH. So, Daniel was known in the media reports later as the boy who held the door open for friends, allowing them to escape from the school during the assault. It's a very heroic notion, but like many of the stories of martyrdom during the crisis, doesn't seem to be supported by witness statements entered into the official reports that followed the investigation of the shootings. But whether he did or didn't, all the people who knew him could agree to one thing. Danny was a young and wonderful man, and he would be sorely missed. Shortly after learning of his death, Dan's mother, Sue Petrone, started a load of laundry in order to do something normal and came across Daniel's shirt and socks. The little things just bring back the horror of the fact that he's not with us anymore, she said. So Dan's funeral was held at Grace Presbyterian Church, and he was buried in Littleton Cemetery in Littleton, Colorado. The next victim is our oldest victim, Dave Sanders. He was born October 22nd, 1951. He was 47 years old. He was a teacher, dad, and grandfather, and his full name was William David Sanders, but he was known as Dave. And he was actually in the cafeteria when he heard gunfire and rushed to warn the students. And he has been hailed to be a hero after he successfully managed to get around 100 students away from the danger. He remained to try to secure as much of the school as he could, but eventually he ran into the shooters. He was shot in the back and the neck as he tried to escape in the opposite direction. DK walked over to Sanders, who had collapsed on the floor, and threw a pipe bomb down the hall. Dave managed to drag himself to the science area where a colleague kept him alive for 3 hours by attempting to stop him losing blood by using shirts from the students in the room. A student held up a sign in the window saying, "One bleeding to death," but the warnings were ignored. His last words were, "Tell my family I love him." So, Dave Sanders, he was a computer and business teacher at Columbine for 25 years and a coach of the girls' basketball and softball teams. He left behind his wife, 4 children, and 5 grandchildren. His students said he was a teacher, a friend, a mentor, and an inspiration. When the gunman did start to fire outside the school, he ran to the cafeteria and sounded the alarm. He, along with 2 of the school's janitors, helped get more than those students out of the path of danger by herding them away from the shooters. He saved untold numbers of lives that day, no doubt. By the time the gunman arrived, the cafeteria was nearly empty thanks to him and the 2 janitors. He was in the upstairs hall trying to get students safely hidden in classrooms when he was shot from behind by E.H. He was hit in the torso, head, and neck. He bled to death waiting for help. 911 dispatchers told students who were helping him was coming, but it never arrived. Trying to get help up to Coach Sanders, it was the student Deidre Kuchera who posted a sign that said "one bleeding to death." Dave's daughter Angela said at his funeral, "What you did in that school on Tuesday was an amazing act of heroism. Even after you were hurt, you continued to be the brave, selfless man we all know you are." Dave was buried in Littleton's Chapel Hill Memorial Gardens. Since his death, Coach Dave Sanders has had a softball field at Columbine and a scholarship named after him to honor his memory, and posthumously received the Arthur Ashe Award for Courage. I am just getting chills right now to just think that you're put in that situation and all you do is just to save everyone else, and you just try to hold on as hard and as much as you can to survive. And if only they would have gotten to him sooner, if the paramedics. And to think 3 hours later, you guys, remember the time frame. This maybe lasted not even an hour, and the fact that they couldn't come in and clear the school, especially once the gunfire stopped. Like, I don't know. It's just so many lives could have been saved just by their response time as well. So our next victim is Kyle Velasquez. He was born May 5th, 1982 and was 16 years old. Kyle was described as a big teddy bear, and he was the first of 10 students who did die during a hostage situation in the school's library. He curled up under a computer table and was killed by shots in the head and back. Kyle suffered a stroke as a baby, and his parents were prepared to spend the rest of their lives with him due to his disabilities. He had been attending Columbine for 3 months and had only started to stay at the school during lunch. So he would have been on his way home if the shooting had happened a few weeks earlier. That is seriously ominous. Neighbors and relatives say that Kyle enjoyed chores and family activities. They say he was a big teddy bear or a gentle giant. He was 6 feet tall and 230 pounds when he died, but those who knew him knew that he was just like a little boy at heart. He was affectionate and sincere. He loved nothing more than helping his dad Al around the house. He would put up shelves, mow the lawn, wash the car, and every day he would kiss his mom Phyllis on the cheek and tell her that he loved her. He wanted to join the Navy like his dad did or become a firefighter. So when he was a baby, he did suffer a stroke that kind of left him mentally disabled, and he also had severe asthma. And as a special needs child, Kyle was often ignored, avoided, and teased while growing up. And so he knew what it was like to be an outcast. He would accompany his mother everywhere while she ran her errands. And Kyle's last words to her were, "Goodbye, I love you, Mom." Kyle was a shy teen, and like I said, he was only at Columbine for a few months. He just started to kind of find his way and come out of his shell when the massacre occurred. Kyle, he loved computers. He had been sitting at one of the computer tables in Columbine's library when the killers did come in, and perhaps he was too confused or frightened by the chaos and noise to hide himself. So DK shot him in the back of the head, and as he passed by, Kyle was the first victim to die in the library. Kyle was buried with military honors in Fort Logan National Cemetery in Denver, Colorado, since his father was a Navy veteran. His parents were given the flags from his coffin and the one that was flown at half-mast in Kyle's honor at the state capitol. The more I read these, you guys, the more chills I get. Okay, so the next victim is Stephen Kernow. He was born August 28th, 1984, and he was 14 years old. I think he might have been the youngest, but... So Stephen, he planned to become a Navy Top Gun pilot, and yeah, he was the youngest victim of the shooting. So he died at the age of 14 after E.H. shot him in the neck with a sawed-off shotgun. He was a Star Wars fan and was anxiously awaiting the release of Star Wars I: The Phantom Menace on May 19th when he died. In a tribute note read at his funeral, Stephen's mom said, "Thank you for the special moment 2 weeks ago when you said, 'Mom, I bet there aren't many guys who can discuss things with their moms like we do.'" Which I think is the sweetest thing. He was very close to his parents, Susan, and his father, Robert, or Bob. He loved soccer and worked part-time as a referee, and his dad, Bob, coached the soccer team. It was the Blue Devils of the Colorado Rush. So Steve liked the color green because it was the color of the field. His favorite classes were Spanish, technology, and gym because he got to play sports. He was a huge Star Wars fan, and he watched the movies so many times that he could recite the dialogue along with the actors. Science fiction fans nationwide put together a go-to Star Wars Memorial Day in his honor when Star Wars I: The Phantom Menace premiered in theaters May 19th, 1999, which is what he had been waiting for the release of. And I think that is so special for them to just do that since he was such a huge fan that they had that Memorial Day in his honor. Steve was hiding under one of the small computer tables in the library near surviving victim Casey Rugseger when the shooting began. E.H. shot Steve in the neck, and Steve died in the library. His funeral was held at Trinity Christian Center, the fourth funeral of a Columbine victim, held there in 5 days. Members of his soccer team were among the mourners at his funeral. Every time we play, he'd have a huge smile on his face. Justin Norman said at the funeral, a former teammate who was among a dozen friends who offered eulogies for Steve. His sister Nancy said at the funeral that she was going to miss fighting with Steve over whose turn it was to take out the garbage and whose turn it was to use a computer. She wondered who would tell stories to her own children about what she was like growing up. She'd been counting on her little brother for that. Steve was buried in Fort Logan National Cemetery in Denver, Colorado. The next victim is Isaiah Scholes, and he was born August 4th, 1980, and he was 18 years old. So Isaiah, he was an aspiring comedian, and he was born with a heart defect, but he managed to overcome his disability, and he went on to play football and wrestle. He had played cornerback the previous year on the football team, but his father claimed he quit possibly because of racial intimidation. Isaiah was black or African American, so just to put that in context for you guys. He was studying in the library with friends Matt Ketcher and Craig Scott when the shooters entered. They hid under a table, but when DK spotted the popular athlete, he called EH over, and the pair flanked the table on either side and started a racist rant against Isaiah. A witness reports of the shooter's racist remarks led Isaiah's parents to later claim that the whole massacre was race-motivated, but that's not true. Isaiah was the only black person killed during the shootings, and in fact, no other black people were even injured during the assault. Although they were racist, it wasn't a hate crime just targeting black people. So they attempted to pull him out from under the table, but when they failed, EH shot him. DK then shot Matt, while Craig survived by playing dead in a pool of blood from his dying friends. Whew. Talk about survival. So Isaiah, he did want to become a comedian. He dreamed of becoming a music executive, and after graduating, he wanted to attend an arts college. Friends nicknamed him Bushwick. So Isaiah, he also played keyboards, whoop whoop, which is what I play. And he wanted to become a record producer like his father Michael, who was the president of Notorious Records and Fort Knox Entertainment. Michael started to promote black musicians in the Denver area. After graduation, Isaiah had planned to attend the Denver Institute of the Arts. Isaiah was actually a popular boy, and Columbine principal Frank DeAngelis said his classmates would compete to work on school projects with him. Isaiah, thank you for having such a positive impact on our school and on our family. You will be greatly missed, and I love you, my dear child. He's smiling down on us, classmate and friend Nick Foss said. I know he is. So he did die from a gunshot wound to the chest. The last of the Columbine victims to be buried, Isaiah was laid to rest in Fairmount Cemetery in Denver, Colorado. Martin Luther King III, who was the son of Martin Luther King Jr., actually spoke at Isaiah's funeral at the Heritage Christian Center. So Matthew Catcher, he was born February 19th, 1983, and he was 16 years old. Of course, he was shot in the chest alongside his pal Isaiah in the library. So Matt played on both the defensive and offensive lines of the school's football team. He was also a weightlifter and a straight-A student. His parents said in a tribute he was a wonderful role model for his little brother. Matt was a sturdy 210-pound sophomore, and he is remembered for his ready laugh. So he was always getting good grades in school, so I'm sure that inspired a lot of his friends or teammates. When I heard he was one of the ones from the library, it only made sense, said sophomore basketball player and close friend Greg Barnes. He was always in the library studying. He always put academics first. He has straight A's, but he would never brag about it. I kind of looked up to him because of it. He was never in a bad mood. He was consistently happy. Tragically, his friend Greg did commit suicide shortly after following the first anniversary of the shootings at Columbine. Matt was in the library studying when the shooting began. He had been seated at a table with his friend, Craig Scott, who is actually the brother of the victim, Rachel Scott, who we talked about earlier. And just to take a moment, Craig did survive and Rachel didn't. Craig was the one who played dead in the pool of blood to make the shooters think he was shot. When the teacher ran in and told everyone to get down, both boys hid under the table they had been sitting at and were joined by Matt's fellow athlete and his friend Isaiah Scholes. After the shooters entered the library, they shot several people before DK spotted Isaiah and called EH's attention to their table. That's when they made racial slurs toward Isaiah, and then EH shot him at a close range. So DK actually fired on Matt next, hitting him in the chest. And Matt died sometime later in the library where he lay. And I'm assuming he probably bled out. He was a wonderful role model for his little brother. His parents wrote in a statement that was read at his funeral at St. Francis Cabrini Catholic Church on April 27th. Their brotherhood had just recently developed into a bonding friendship. In Matt's heart, there was always enough room for everyone to be victorious. The University of Colorado, which is where Matt had planned to attend school, sent his younger brother Adam one of their jerseys bearing Matt's name and the jersey number he wore, 70, as part of the Columbine's football team. The Columbine High School football team all wore ribbons bearing his old jersey number, and they were asked to dedicate the next season to Matt's memory at his funeral service. Matt was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. In September of 1999, Matt was accepted posthumously in the National Honor Society. Alright, so the next victim is Lauren Townsend. She was born January 17th, 1981, and she was 18 years old. Lauren died on the library floor after being shot several times in the head, chest, and lower body. She was shot more times than any of the other victims, but the reason for that still remains unknown. Lauren, she was a straight-A student who volunteered at a local animal shelter, and she was captain of the volleyball team, which her mom coached. She was hiding under a table with friends and kept her arm around Val Schnur, who survived, and told her everything would be okay before the killers shot her dead. Lauren, she was a senior, and not only did she play volleyball, she was captain of their varsity team, and her mom, Donna Anna, coached. So she was a member of the National Honor Society, and she was actually a candidate for valedictorian of her graduating class. Lauren was a talented sketch artist as well, and she was nicknamed Lulu, and she was planning on majoring in biology at Colorado State University when she graduated from Columbine. She was in the library with her friends, which was Lisa Kreutz, Dewada Perez, Valine or Val Schneier, and Gianna Park when the shooting began. After several minutes of hearing the gunman taunt and shoot other people hiding in the library, one of the killers, DK, came to Lauren's table. He opened fire, injuring Lisa and Val. He fired again as fast as his weapon would shoot, and he hit Lauren several times. A few minutes later, EH came back around the table and shot beneath it again, hitting Lauren again, but she didn't feel it. She was already dead by that time. So she died on the floor of the library from multiple bullet and shotgun wounds to the head, chest, lower body. Her funeral was held at Foothills Bible Church, where her brother, Josh, played a tribute video filled with moments from her life. Many of her teachers spoke at her funeral, commending her gentle nature, loving spirit, as well as her academic excellence. Her coffin was a white one that people attending her funeral could write on, much like one would sign a yearbook, which is ominous, the fact that she was about to graduate. Her father wrote, "Lulu, you'll always be my baby." So she was buried in Littleton Cemetery in Littleton, Colorado. Man, she just seems like she was so well ahead and so ready. She was ready to graduate, ready to start her life in college, and it was taken away from her. And then even in her last moment, she was there comforting her friend. So next victim is John Tomlin. He was born September 1st, 1982, and he was 16 years old. John spent his lunch break in the library studying when EH and DK stormed in. He hid under a table and welcomed Nicole Nolan in his hiding place, where he held her hand in comfort while they listened to the shooters kill their classmates. EH shot John without looking who was under the table before DK went around and shot him point blank in the end. Nicole was shot in the stomach, but she did survive. So John was actually a native of Wisconsin, and he worked after school at a local nursery, hauling trees, and belonged to a church youth group where he met his girlfriend of several months, Michelle Oter. Family and friends remember his energy and the warmth of his smile. He loved church and Chevy trucks. He had recently got his driver's license, and of course, he just bought an old Chevy pickup they had been working on for since he was 14. So he was saving up money to buy that since he was 14, and he bought it. He once drove all the way to Mexico to help build a house for a poor family. He enjoyed four-wheeling in his truck and lifting weights. His truck, kind of like Rachel Scott's car, became a standing memorial in the parking lot. Thursday, following the shootings, his family gathered around the truck despite the fact that it was raining. His Bible was still sitting on the dashboard where he always left it in the hope that someone would see something there that would bring them closer to God. He was a perfect son, his father, John Michael Tomlin, said. He was just good. You'd ask him to wash a car and he'd wash both cars. John spent his lunch hour in the library daily studying. So the first of the funerals for the victims killed at Columbine, his was held at Foothills Bible Church, where he attended church. He was buried in his hometown of Waterford, Wisconsin, in St. Peter's Cemetery. He was buried in a satin-lined coffin embroidered with Chevy trucks, which, what a way to honor him, especially because he loved Chevy, and he loved Chevy trucks. Ooh, as I go through it, it's getting harder and harder because all of these are kids except for the one teacher who died who was a hero. And so just going through these and reading about it's really hard, and it really puts into perspective that this isn't just like a mass shooting we see on TV. These are real people, real victims, and real lives lost. So it's hard to read off these, but in the reality, it's something that we need to come more to grips with. We need to remember the victims and not so much the shooters. We do need to understand the shooters and their psychopathy to help understand their minds and their motives to prevent this from happening again. But that's why I like to talk about the victims more. We need to give them more notice than, unfortunately, what the shooters have gotten. So next victim was Kelly Fleming. She was 16. She was born January 6th, 1983, which is a Capricorn, and I only know that because my birthday is January 3rd, so She was born years before me, but a couple days after me. So Kelly was new to Columbine. She moved there about 3 months before the shooting happened. And she was actually in the library writing poems as she would when EH and DK entered. So Kelly tried to hide under a table with a group of girls, but due to a lack of room, she was partially visible. So coming up from behind, EH shot Kelly in the back, and her body was found close to Lauren's. Kelly and her family, they moved to Littleton from Phoenix, Arizona, 18 months before the shooting. And so her dad, Dawn, said that they scorned the area looking for a good neighborhood where their daughters would be safe. Kelly was shy and creative, and she loved Halloween. Sounds like my kind of girl. And she was an aspiring songwriter and author who wrote many poems and short stories based on her life experiences. She had been writing an autobiography on her home computer. She started when her mom's water broke and had gotten as far as her 5th year, which, man, you'd have to ask a lot of questions because I don't even have memories up until maybe when I was 4, so it's amazing that she was able to do that. She often did go to Columbine's library to write, and her stories often had happy endings. Kelly was learning to drive, and she wanted to get a job at a daycare center and save enough money to buy a Mustang or a Corvette. She longed to be able to drive so she could return to Phoenix for a visit or go on road trips. She loved to read, especially books about vampires, and one day she hoped to be a published author and often entered writing contests. I feel like I would be best friends with Kelly. The fact that she loves Halloween, she likes kind of the creepier things like vampires, she likes to write. She sounds cool. I would click with her. So her mom, Dee, remembered Kelly coming home from school 2 months before the shooting, saying, "I'm not shy anymore." Which I think is amazing because as a kid, like a kid, not high school kid, but when I was like in kindergarten up until maybe 5th grade, I was really shy. And a lot of people were kind of taken back by that. They're like, "You, Katie, shy?" And I'm like, yeah, I was shy at one point. And I just kind of grew out of that. And it felt like Kelly was starting to become more comfortable and starting to grow out of that. When the shooters did enter the library, the table she was hiding, it was beside a table with other girls who she had been sitting with, which was Lisa Kreutz, Gianna Parker, Dewada Perez, Valine Schnur, and Lauren Townsend. At one point, DK fired under the table, which was what injured Val and Lisa, and then he fired his gun again, which killed Lauren. Both gunmen reloaded their weapons and taunted Val, asking her if she believed in God. The shooters then moved away from Kelly's table, moving to another table where they shot Nicole Newland and killed John Tomlin, and then they circled back around and came back to the girls' table. And coming up from behind, he shot Kelly in the back with his shotgun. Her body was found on the floor near Lauren Townsend, and Kelly's father said, "Here's one of the real leaders of the school, and our Kelly was next to someone like that. I'm sure Karen took care of Kelly. She wasn't alone." He also said he prayed for the parents of the shooters. They'll have a tougher time getting over this than we will. Kelly's funeral was held at the same time as Daniel Mauser's at the St. Francis Cabrini Catholic Church, and she was buried with 2 teddy bears in her arms. Her grave is located at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. And so we mentioned her funeral was held at the same time as Daniel Mauser. And Daniel Mauser is actually our next victim. He was born June 25th, 1983, and he was 15 years old. And he actually hid under a table and pushed a chair in front of him when EH approached in an attempt to knock him over, which is pretty brave, actually. EH commented nice glasses before he shot Daniel in the face. Daniel was concerned with America's gun laws and asked his dad about loopholes in the Brady Bill just 2 weeks before he died. And then he was shot by a gun bought through one of the loopholes he had questioned, apparently. So Daniel, he was a sophomore, and he excelled in math and science, and he got straight A's on his last report card. His dad, Tom, remembered that his son was a smart young man who wasn't afraid of challenges and who wasn't ashamed to hug his parents. Which I just love that. Because remember, teenage years, usually you don't really want to be seen with your parents or get affection in front of others. And he was affectionate. He didn't care. He did attend Ken Carl Middle School, the same school the shooters went to. But there's no record of them really knowing each other. Daniel was shy, but he didn't let that stop him from joining the debate team. And though he wasn't a natural athlete, he still joined the cross-country team. He liked to ski, camp, and recently returned from a 2-week trip to Paris with the French club. He had received straight A's in his classes for the last 2 grading periods and won the Stretch for Excellence Award for being named the top biology student of the sophomore class at Columbine High School. Sadly, he actually died before he could learn that he'd been selected for that honor. Daniel was posthumously accepted for membership into the National Honor Society in September of 1999 along with others. He had applied for membership weeks before the shootings. Daniel is described by his family as shy, a gentle soul, lovable, and loving. He was close friends with his sister Christine, and Daniel, my guy, he loved pepperoni pizza, amen. He played video games and computer games, and he liked to watch shows like The Simpsons and The X-Files. I think I would be friends with this kid as well. Daniel, he was fond of trivia and knowledge games, as well as swimming and hiking. His father had hoped that in the summer of 1999 to take Daniel on his first 14,000 mountain hike. So Daniel, he did volunteer at the Swedish hospital, and he was preparing for confirmation in the Catholic Church. He would have been confirmed at St. Francis Cabrini Church 2 weeks after the date of his death. His class put a plaque in the team program room in Daniel's honor. Daniel was hoping to get his driver's license in 2000. His dad was motivated by what he interpreted as a sign of action because Daniel was shot with a gun, and Tom is now kind of motivated by this, I guess, and he's a protester of the NRA, and he continues to campaign for stricter gun laws in the wake of his son's tragic death. So Daniel was in the library when he was shot in the face by E.H., and he was hiding under one of the tables. His funeral was held jointly with Kelly Fleming's at St. Francis Cabrini Catholic Church, and he was also buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. So, not long after the shootings, Daniel's family, along with several other families of the victims, learned that the school district was planning to reopen the library where Daniel and the others had died. The plan was to make cosmetic changes such as obviously removing the carpet, repainting, replacing bullet-riddled shelves, and the monsters along with several other volunteers were upset by this, and they found the Hope Foundation, which is healing of people everywhere, and together they convinced the district to tear out the old library and replace it. They didn't want them to just make cosmetic changes here and there. They wanted it just completely replaced, which I love that the families kind of stood together and voiced what they wanted, and that they were able to convince the district to do that. The next victim is Corey D. Pooter. He was born March 3rd, 1982, and was 17, and he was described as an all-American kid who put schoolwork above everything else. His friend Stephen Austin Eubanks watched on as DK aimed a semi-automatic weapon at Corey and pulled the trigger. So he witnessed his friend getting murdered. Austin said in a tribute to Corey, "People said he was the kind of guy people like to be around. I know I sure did. Corey was always able to pick our spirits up in a gloomy situation." So Corey, he was a former wrestler, and he loved to hike, golf, hunt, and fish. He loved wrestling, golf, and inline skating, but fishing was his passion. He had recently taken a maintenance job at the golf club to save up. He actually wanted to buy a fishing boat with a friend. So someone that always fished with Corey said it was the times we didn't do well that his personality really shined. Which, that can be frustrating if you're trying to fish and can't catch a fish. And so just imagine Corey is the one who would say, you know, it's okay, or that's when he really started to pick people up. Another friend said of him, when you're going fishing or camping, I know he's going to be there watching and making sure you're doing everything right. So he seemed like he was pretty organized or meticulous as well. He had his wisdom teeth removed that year, and he was actually upset that the procedure had forced him to miss school. He enjoyed school very much. So he was actually hiding under a table near the windows with his best friend, Stephen Austin Eubanks, and surviving victim, Jennifer Doyle, when the shooters did enter the library. And that's when Austin had to watch him be killed. He was killed instantly. Corey did die in the library from multiple gunshot wounds to the neck, chest, and left arm. His funeral was held at Trinity Christian Church. Soon after his death, his grandmother, Fern Hamilton, contacted the Marine Corps about holding some sort of ceremony for Corey. He always wanted to become a Marine. On May 3rd, 2000, Corey was granted that dream during a ceremony at his gravesite in Chapel Hill Memorial Gardens in Littleton, where he was made an honorary Marine. To break this down, 10 people died in the school's library. EH and DK, they murdered 13 people. So remember, 10 of those, the majority were in the library. They were murdered in cold blood, and they left 24 people with serious injuries. So at probably around 21 people were shot. After leaving the library, the gunman walked around the science area and cafeteria before re-entering the library, which was empty of surviving students at this point, apart from 2 injured people. So they were perhaps planning to watch their car bombs, which were set for noon, but of course they failed to go off. EH sat down with his back to the bookshelves and shot himself through the roof of his mouth, and DK went down on his knees and shot himself in the left temple. EH killed 9 people, including himself. Remember, there's 13 victims. I want to talk about some of the students that were injured in the massacre. It's not going to do a deep dive into their lives, but just kind of where they were shot and where they were at the time. Some of these we already mentioned, but I just want to honor them as well, even though they are surviving victims. Richard Castaldo, he was 17. Shot in the arm, chest, back, and abdomen alongside the west entrance to the school, which was where Rachel Scott was as well. Sean Graves, he was 15, shot in the back, foot, and abdomen near the west staircase. Lance Kirkland, he was 16. He was critically injured by shots to the leg, neck, and jaw near the west staircase, close to Sean Graves. Michael Johnson, 15, shot in the face, arm, and leg to the west of the staircase. Mark Taylor, 16, shot in the chest, arms, and leg to the west of the staircase. Anne Marie Holzhalter was 17, shot in the chest, arm, abdomen, back, and left leg near the cafeteria's entrance. Brian Anderson, 17, injured near the west entrance by flying glass, so he wasn't shot, but he was one of those that was injured due to not being shot. Patty Nielsen was hit in the shoulder by shrapnel near the west entrance. And Stephanie Munson, 17, she was shot in the ankle inside the north hallway. Alright, so that is the story of Columbine, the psychopathy of the perpetrators, the background behind them, their motivations, and getting to know the victims, because they are the most important aspects of this case, and they should be the ones that are remembered. Like I said, we have to remember that the perpetrators, they wanted infamy. They wanted to be famous because of their actions. Even though they dreamed bigger and it just ended up being a shooting, which they kind of mocked shooters, they wanted this on a more massive scale. They wanted people to fear them and think that they had power. So, not gonna give them that. We give power to the victims. With that, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. We're still going to continue with this series, but we'll give it a little bit of a break. I'm your host, Katie Gonzalez, and you've been listening to What the Psychology.
Stay psych, y'all.